Hey everybody, and Tony here with my review of Janacek's Jenufa, which I saw at the Staatsoper Unter in Linden. The conductor was Antonino Maracorda, the production was done by Damiano Michieletto, the sets were done by Paolo Fantin, the costumes were done by Carla Tetti, the lights were handled by Alessandro Carletti, the choreographer was Thomas William, and the chorus master was Martin Wright. I was really excited to check out this particular production of Janacek's Jenufa at the Staatsoper Unter in Linden because, number one, Jenufa is my most favorite Janacek opera of all time, and I thought that it would be nice to see another production of this opera that I hold so dearly to my heart. And two, this opera premiered at the Staatsoper Unter den Linden 2 years ago, and it also starred Evelyn Herlitzius, who sang the role of Kostelniczka Petrona Buryovka. I will gladly talk about her much later in this review, but first, my thoughts on the production. To say that it was frigid, rigid, garish, and absolutely too cold is a mere understatement, especially in terms of my sentiments of how I felt about Damiano Michieletto's production of Jenufa. I was not too huge of a fan of this production of Jenufa because, as I stated before, it was garish, it was devoid of any life, and it was also devoid of any bucolic scenery that I would associate with any traditional production of Jenufa. I understand the approach of what this production was trying to do. It was trying to show the rigid, cold, and uncompromising world of Kostelniczka Petrona Buryovka, but it's at the expense of having all of these minimal sets and not a lot to work with in terms of the overall environment. The only props that are present are some benches, a rosemary plant, and some garish lighting here and there. There are some interesting, albeit unsubtle directions of what this production accomplished, such as the appearance of a huge glacier, especially in the second and third acts of the opera, to show that the Kostelniczka has done something completely horrible, and now she has to atone for what she has done, i.e. killed Jenufa's and Steva's baby boy, and once that huge glacier descends, it just serves as a reminder of the atrocity that the Kostelniczka committed. And in the end of the opera, the Kostelniczka remains with that glacier as if though that she is cleansing herself of her iniquities, especially considering that she killed her own grandchild. And the other interesting prop to be found is Jenufa's knitting of her baby's sweater, which is the color red and is also the same color as his cap. In the first act, the sweater is nearly done being knitted. However, in the second act, the sweater is in absolute tatters and it falls apart, thus showing that yes, in the first act, there is some semblance of life in her womb, and she is very excited for her baby, although Steva is not the father type to be excited for his newborn son that he had with Jenufa. And once the Kostelniczka does the dirty deed, the thread ends up being unraveled to show that Jenufa's precious baby boy is no longer alive, and something terrible must have happened to him. It's revealed that her poor baby boy has died. More specifically, drowned by the Kostelniczka. And aside from the Kostelniczka rebaptizing herself under the glacier, there's also a light change to show that Jenufa's and Latsa's new world is about to begin, what with the lighting bearing more resemblance to daylight than the garish lighting that was seen in the first previous acts. Just to show that the rigidity and the tight control that the Kostelniczka had in her town is over, and it's time for Jenufa and Latsa to begin their life anew, although they will still feel a lot of pain, uncertainty, and sadness and mourning, but at least they can stay strong for each other. The costume choices were also quite interesting, as this seems to transport from the 19th century Moravian village to somewhere in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s at the latest. But my guess would be between the 1950s and 1960s, considering the mayor's wife's poofy hair, as well as Karolka's aquamarine suit. And even the fashion styles that the grandmother, the Kostelniczka, Jenufa, Latza, Stefa, and everybody else wears. Some of it resembles 1950s to 1960s style clothing, whereas other characters such as Jano, the shepherdess, and the auntie wear slightly more grayish toned clothes to show that they are of the people and not necessarily of upper ranks. Overall, while I do feel like this production is completely bereft of the bucolic scenery that I love in many traditional production of Jenufa, and while I would have loved to have a lot more greenery, mills, and even some nice architecture to be found here and there, and while I will never be a huge fan of this production because of how garish and how frigid it was, I can still give it credit for Damiano Michieletto's interesting directions that it managed to take, whether it be from the symbolism involving the red sweater and the red cap, and even the red knitting work that Jenufa is doing, and even that glacier that shows that it is both a sign of the terrible deed that the Kostelniczka committed, and even a sign of atonement that she has to endure. There were some things that I did enjoy about it, but other than that, the complete lack of bucolic scenery made me feel rather turned off by this entire production. And some of the costume choices were quite interesting and quite colorful to look at. Nevertheless, I would still recommend a traditional production of Jenufa if you still want to see bucolic scenery. And now we get to the singers, starting off with Asmik Grigorian as Jenufa. I've been following Asmik Grigorian for quite a long time. First watching her as Tatiana from Evgeny Onegin at the Komische Oper Berlin, and seeing her career grow from these lyrical roles to singing more beefy roles such as Fedora from Giordano's Fedora, and even Chrysothemis from Elektra, as well as Salome from Richard Strauss's Salome. Her natural lyric soprano voice does fit the role of Jenufa quite well. It's not really a great voice, but her lyric soprano voice was able to fit Jenufa's girlishness so well, just as well as how her voice managed to adapt itself to Tatiana's sense of girlishness 7 years ago. I would even argue that roles like Tatiana, Jenufa, Suor Angelica, and a lot of these virginal full lyric soprano roles are a perfect fit for Asmik Grigorian rather than the steelier, beefier roles such as Chrysothemis or Salome, let alone Fedora. Because Asmik Grigorian's natural full lyric soprano voice is able to convey Jenufa's pain, suffering, anguish, anxieties, and everything else that she feels throughout the opera convincingly well. Yes, there are other more convincing singers of Jenufa, such as Trude Eiperle, whose beautiful lyric soprano voice is purely toned and absolutely gorgeous to listen to, and who also made such a wonderful job singing Jenufa's music with everything she's got. And even my personal favorites being Sena Jurnat, who also had fine chest tones and an equally great coordination between head voice and chest voice to make the role of Jenufa her own. And lest I forget about Elisabeth Söderström, who also used her full lyric soprano voice to make a great impression out of Jenufa. And if we're talking about singers in the 80s and the 90s, Gabriela Benatskova was also a fine Jenufa who made the best out of not only her lyricism, but also adding in some metal in her voice. I say that Asmik Grigorian is more of a lyric soprano because she doesn't really have the steeliness, let alone the meatiness and the beefiness suitable for roles such as Fedora, Chrysothemis, or even that of Tosca and Salome. These are voices that do require more dramatic singing and more spinto-like singing. As I stated before, virginal roles such as Jenufa and Suor Angelica, as well as Tatiana, are far more suitable for Asmik Grigorian because she's able to portray the fragility of these characters as well as their moments of strength. Furthermore, this is also evidenced by her solid technical prowess. She does have good chest tones to work with. She also has some strong top notes, although they're more high in the larynx instead of being more pharyngeal. And while her chest tones are not particularly full, let alone her chest voice and head voice coordination isn't completely there, she's still able to compensate all of those vocal shortcomings with her theatricality and her flair for drama. Asmik Grigorian as a singing actress is far from the best interpreter of Jenufa of all time, with a couple of my personal favorites being Sena Jurinats, Hildegard Hillebrecht, and Elisabeth Söderström. But her flair for drama and her natural lyric soprano voice, which should actually stay within the lyric soprano repertoire, prove that Jenufa is a good fit for her. So I still have to give her credit for what she was able to pull off as Jenufa, which was a role that she has been singing for quite some time. Evelyn Herlitzius definitely stole the show as the Kostelniczka Petrona Boryovka, as she's always done, especially in previous performances in this role. Interestingly enough, Evelyn Herlitzius was once upon a time a singer of Jenufa, but I personally believe that the role of the Kostelniczka fits her perfectly. Yes, Evelyn Herlitzius is still an acquired taste when it comes to her capabilities as a singing actress, let alone as a singer. She has that constant tendency to wobble. There are times that she is so strident in her top notes, and her overall vocal production leaves so much to be desired because it is so flawed, full of tremolos, full of unevenness, full of loose vibratos, and full of wobbles to the wazoo. However, Evelyn Herlitzius was also in possession of some really damn good chest tones, which she was able to sing with fullness and richness and with total abandon. But more than anything, Evelyn Herlitzius' top notes, despite them being so strident, were also the main highlight of the evening, as they've always been regardless of every performance she was in. I have seen her as Electra. I have seen her as Emilia Marti, and I've seen her in a lot of roles which she was able to let loose with those top notes and let loose with her voice despite the many flaws that it had. And more than anything, Evelyn Herlitzius' greatest strength is her unparalleled and unapologetic sense of theatricality. The way she was able to move around the stage, the way she was able to take advantage of both the Kostelniczka's stern nature as well as her hysterical histrionics, especially in her solo aria Zotsvilha, and lest I forget about her unquestioned commitment as an artist, can never ever be paralleled, let alone be doubted by anybody, whether they are fans of Evelyn Herlitzius or whether they are detractors of hers. She is still a singing actress who throws herself in this role with everything she's got, and she definitely stole the show tonight. Yes, I still have at my disposal my personal favorite interpreters of the Kostelniczka, and those include Martha Mödel, Margareta Klose, Aga Jöstin, Astrid Varnay, Ludmila Vorshkova, Irene Dallas, Rita Gor, Sigrid Kehl, Nadezhda Kniplova, and even Eva Randova, with Martha Mödel and Astrid Varnay being the reigning supreme interpreters of the Kostelniczka, thanks to their chest tones, and thanks to their round and rich instruments that could even give many a dramatic mezzo, let alone many a dramatic soprano, a run for their money. But even with all of Evelyn Herlitzius' vocal problems, she's still able to be as committed as ever as a singing actress in terms of bringing life to Kostelniczka, both in her stern moments, as well as her haggard moments, as well as in her most human moments, and even the moment where she ends up resigning herself to be bathed under that huge iceberg as a means to atone for her sins, as well as to find more forgiveness for everything that she has done. Despite Evelyn Herlitzius leaving a lot to be desired as a singer, I can never ever doubt her artistry, and I can never doubt her absolute penchant for drama, which she was able to use with flair and who was able to take advantage of the Kostelnichka's complex emotions and put them all out on the forefront. And out of all the main women, Evelyn Herlitzius was that one performer who stood tall and proud as the best performer of the evening, all thanks to her unparalleled flair for drama, as well as what she was able to use with her voice, despite the many flaws that it had in terms of letting it ring throughout the theater, and also do some vocal acting with it to show the Kostelnichka's pain, regret, anger, sadness, and every emotion that she feels throughout the opera. All technical problems that I had with Evelyn Herlitzius aside, in terms of her wobble and her all over the place vibrato, and I could still cheer her on for what she was able to bring to the table as the Kostelnichka. Hanna Schwarz may not be the chastiest sounding grandmother Burgovka of all time, but she still continues to be a dedicated singing actress as she's always been. It's no surprise that Hanna Schwarz has been singing the grandmother for about 10, 20, let alone 30 years, and she has made the best out of this particular character part. I should know because 9 years ago, I also saw her in this very same role at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, and I thought she was really good. Here, I thought she was just as good, but her voice was not always that chesty. It's not a voice that I would associate with somebody who is an authentic mezzo, let alone a contralto. In fact, voices that I would associate for the role of the grandmother would be the likes of Res Fischer, Else Schurhoff, Elisabeth Högen, Lilian Bennigsen, Hilde Rösel-Maidan, Elizabeth Bainbridge, and even to some extent Viorica Cortez, although she was more of a high dramatic mezzo. But more than any of these mezzos and contraltos, it's ultimately the likes of Else Schurhoff as well as Ina Gerthein who managed to steal the show as the grandmother because of their deep, rich, and low chest tones, and the fact that these voices were quite ideal for this type of role. Hanna Schwarz still has that semblance of her mezzo-soprano voice that she has been using ever since the 1960s all the way up to the 1970s in her younger years. And while it still sounds weathered, at least Hanna Schwarz was able to be sufficiently fine as a singing actress all the way through. Perhaps her most imperative strength is how she was able to make the best out of the grandmother and make it her own, which she has been doing for several years, thus finding ways to make the grandmother a sympathetic character and somebody who may not be as totally great of a grandmother role model to, let's say, Steva, because she spoils him a lot, but she's still a singing actress who is able to find the human element in her, rather than just have her be the doting old woman one moment and the stern old matriarch in the next moment. She was still able to find that middle ground as a singing actress, and I still have to applaud Hanna Schwarz for what she was able to accomplish as the grandmother. Stefan Rügema was a disappointment as Latza Kremen because his nasality, his maskiness, that buzzy tone that he's had, and that unpleasant tone were totally off-putting for someone who was supposed to be young, virile, stubborn, and quite hard-headed. Yes, Stefan Rügema continues to let his voice project well throughout the theater, but when it's backed up by a tone that is nasal, masky, and otherwise extremely unpleasant to listen to, then you might as well have Mr. Rügema sing the likes of Mime, let alone the idiot from Wozzeck, instead of something as bicep-flexing and macho like Latza Kremen. Voices that come to my mind in this particular role are the likes of Willem Prebel, John Vickers, Richard Casserly, Benno Blachut, and Wislav Ochman, because whether these tenors were spinto tenors or dramatic tenors, or even to some extent Heldentenors, they had more incisive voices, more secure voices that could cut through an orchestra, and had naturally steely voices that could be able to bring out that youthful impetuousness and that easily jealous quality that defines Latza as a character. I am not going to fault Stefan Rügema for what he was able to accomplish as an actor. It's just that his voice as Latza Kremen left so much to be desired. It did not sound like a young man who is easily jealous and a young man who is totally infatuated with Jenufa and constantly pines for her attention. It just sounds like Mime just entered the wrong opera, or even the idiot or the captain from Wozzeck entered in the wrong opera and is constantly in pursuit of Jenufa, which if I were Jenufa in this situation, I'd feel creeped out by him. I would have loved to have a much fuller sounding tenor singing this role, let alone a meteor sounding tenor sing this role, complete with an incisive voice that can sing over an orchestra. And while Stefan Rügema is a little bit more subdued in terms of making Latza's manliness as well as his jealousy be a little bit more subtle, his overall vocal production left way too much to be desired, but I still have to begrudgingly give him some credit for at least being brave enough to tackle this role with everything he's got. Even though Stefan Rügema's voice was akin to Mime from Rheingold and Siegfried, or even the idiot and the captain from Wozzeck entering in the wrong opera and constantly pursuing Jenufa, thus making her feel freaked out, at least I cannot question the commitment that Stefan Rügema has as an actor in terms of bringing Latza's jealousy to the forefront. Edgaras Montvidas was absolutely handsome as Stefa, and I thought that he was the better tenor as well as the overall better singer in terms of the two tenor roles. What he was able to accomplish with his steely, full lyric tenor voice was that he was able to bring an impetuousness. He was able to give Stefa his recklessness and his overall lack of direction, thus making him impetuous at best. And while Edgaras Montvidas's vocal production is rather unorthodox to the ears because of that funny sound it produces, and while it doesn't have that pure tone that I love in many a true spinto tenor, let alone dramatic tenor, or even lyric tenor singing Stefa, such as Jean Cox, Ivo Zidek, Mark Baker, William Lewis, and even Robleto Morella, Edgaras Montvidas was able to make great use of his full lyric tenor voice to make the best out of Stefa. Yes, his vocal production is rather unorthodox, but he is supported by a damn good technique in terms of letting his voice ring over the orchestra and even sing over it with everything he's got. And his stage presence was strong all the way through, thus making me salute Edgaras Montvidas for everything that he accomplished as a singing actor. David Ostrek is far from the deepest and darkest sounding mayor, but he had a strong and tall stage presence, which has helped his performances shine all the way through, despite his voice not being that of a true basso cantante, let alone a true basso profondo. It's more bass baritone in repertoire, but more baritonal in quality at most. Darker voices from Max Probstel and Frederick Guthrie can never ever be eclipsed because of how cavernous their voices were, but David Ostrek did use his tall and handsome stage presence to make the best out of the mayor. Stephen Clark may not have the ideal vocal darkness to make the role of the mill foreman come to life, but his stage presence was just as strong, and he also made use of his lyric baritone voice to make the best out of this character. Yes, I can never ever neglect voices such as Raymond Gunbrach or even Reidbunga, whose voices had more security and sufficient depth to bring this particular role to life. But with what Stephen Clark accomplished was nothing short of fine in terms of what he was able to do with his commanding stage presence as well as his voice, that while not being dark enough to make this role come to life, and I would argue still needs a lot more development in reaching those low notes, still had an interesting quality that does show potential for more vocal growth in the right direction. Therefore, Stephen Clark's performance as the mill foreman in terms of his skills as an actor was solid all the way through, but vocally speaking, it lacked in richness and depth. Natalia Skrytska was elegant as the mayor's wife, and she was decked to the nines with that poofy red hair as well as that businesswoman attire, thus making her absolutely elegant to witness on stage. And she was able to make great use of her stage presence and her equally fine lyric mezzo voice to make the best out of the mayor's wife. Yes, there were chestier voices such as Christa Ludwig, who also sang this role back in the 1950s. And lest I forget about Ivana Miksova, who was also once upon a time a very well-known interpreter of Carmen, who also made use of her mezzo-soprano voice to make the best out of the mayor's wife. And lest I forget about the likes of Hilda Konecny and Marianne Szech, who were once upon a time fine dramatic sopranos in their prime, but also sang character parts much later in their careers, with Hilda Konecny also singing a lot of the character mezzo parts, not only as the mayor's wife, but also as Berta from Barbiere, and even Madelon from Umberto Giordano's Andrea Chenier, as well as Marianne Szech, who was also once upon a time a fine singer of Jenufa and the Kostelniczka, but also sang the role of the mayor's wife alongside Astrid Varnay as the Kostelniczka, and Hildegard Hillebrecht as Jenufa. But when all is said and done, Natalia Skrycka was in a class of her own, and she was able to make the best out of the mayor's wife with everything that she's got, and she had sufficient plushness in her lyric mezzo voice to also make her sound elegant and not withered, thus showing sufficient vocal strength for such an otherwise thankless role. There is no doubt that Evelyn Novak was an absolutely gorgeous darling of a Karolka. She is actually quite up there with the likes of Kate Lindlof, Lucia Pop, and even Hilde de Groot as my personal favorite interpreters of Karolka, and arguably many light lyric sopranos before her. But Evelyn Novak's pristine technical prowess remains unquestioned, remains untainted, and remains as pure as always. This is a lyric soprano who is utterly and totally dependable in all of these ingenue roles, as well as roles that do require more lyrical singing. Whether she does all these soubrette-ish roles like Karolka or Susanna, or even lyrical roles such as Mimi or Michaela, Evelyn Novak is the right woman for all of these roles because of her fine technical prowess, as well as her absolutely gorgeous, darling stage presence that was able to make Karolka a likable, interesting, and fun character, but also make her quite the daddy's and mommy's girl, as well as a girl who finds Steva quite strapping and handsome, but is utterly repulsed by him when she finds out all the shit that he's done, thus making Evelyn Novak's characterization of Karolka absolutely involving, all thanks and especially powered by her fine and pristine lyric soprano voice that managed to radiate and shimmer throughout the orchestra and bring a huge smile on my face every time she appeared on stage. There was also some equally fine singing to be found in Clara Nadezhdin's gorgeously sung Auntie, Ekaterina Heika Rubinstein's gorgeously sung and well-controlled Shepherdess, who also had good chest tones to match, and an equally beautiful future to look forward to once she continues to develop her instrument in the right possible way. Anna Zamwil's metallic yet lovely lyric soprano voice making the best out of Barena's music, Regina Conch's soubrette-ish charm being a welcome delight as Yano, especially considering that her light soprano voice just shimmers like sunshine, and I would also love to hear her in more challenging roles, whether it be as Zerbinetta or the Fiacremili one day, or even those of Frasquita from Carmen and even Urbain from Les Huguenots, because the possibilities for Miss Conch are absolutely endless, as well as Ben Bloomfield and Regina Köstler-Motz contributing their voices very well as the two offstage voices. So overall, the singing did have a lot of great qualities to go for, as well as something that's interesting to be found in each singer, although there were some flaws to be found here and there. While I was not a huge fan of Stefan Rugama and his nasality and his maskiness being the detractors for his vocal performance as Latsa, and while I do believe that this role should have been sung by another tenor, like we could have had Pavel Chernok sing the role of Latsa, or even that of Stuart Skelton striking back in this particular role, I can still give him some credit for what he was able to do theatrically. But ultimately, it was Evelyn Herlitzius who stole the show as the Kostelniczka. Despite her vocal flaws, and despite whatever vocal issues that she's been always having throughout her career, she was still an involved singing actress through and through, and she threw everything in to make Kostelniczka a very involving character. And Asmik Grigorian also had a solid technique to make her characterization of Jenufa just as lifelike and human as possible. And Hannah Schwartz, being the veteran mezzo-soprano that she is, managed to make fine use of grandmother Burgovska's music. And yes, both David Ostrek and Stephen Clark were not really as deep sounding as the mayor and the mill foreman respectively, but they had strong stage presences to boot. But among the men, it was Edgaras Montvidas who stole the show as Stefa, and even Natalia Skritska and Evelyn Novak, who sang the roles of the mayor's wife and Karolka respectively, used their fine sense of artistry to make the best out of these characters, especially where Evelyn Novak's sterling performance as Karolka managed to steal my heart in the best possible way, all thanks to her pristine technique, and of course that silvery, shimmering, and absolutely sweet-sounding lyric soprano voice that made Evelyn Novak an absolute treat to listen to every time I see her on stage. And the additional contributions made by Anna Zamuil, Ekaterina Chaika Rubinstein, Clara Nadeshtin, and of course Regina Conch being my personal favorite out of these small roles were absolute highlights. But with Regina Conch being the true standout out of these smaller roles. The singing may vary in quality from not so great to really good, but one thing remains, everybody was on board, and it was a unified effort that made everybody strong despite all the flaws that were there and all the flaws that cannot be denied. The conducting done by Antonello Manacorda was rather lightweight in comparison to a lot of the great conductors of the past, and there were occasions in which the pacing was a bit all over the place, but he did find some nice moments of quiet solitude and also some nuance here and there, although I could argue that some of the more intense moments could have been using a lot more fire and passion, but he kept the orchestra together. He made sure that everybody was together from beginning to end, and the chorus and orchestra of the Staatsoper Unter den Linden were, as always, reliable. So overall, with a production that I was not a huge fan of, singing that was actually quite interesting in terms of quality, especially with Evelyn Herlitzius stealing the show from everybody's feet, followed by Asmik Grigorian as Jenufa, and by Hannah Schwartz as the grandmother in terms of the three main ladies, with Evelyn Herlitzius and Asmik Grigorian standing on top as the two main ladies to steal the show from everybody else's feet, as well as some actually decent conducting done by Antonella Maracorda. This was quite an interesting evening for Jenufa. While it would have been great to see a traditional production of Jenufa, I could still give the singers credit for what they were able to accomplish in their respective roles, whether they be the main roles, or the supporting roles, or the small roles. Everybody was a trooper through and through, despite the flaws, despite the vocal troubles, and despite those moments of inconsistencies happening here and there. Everybody was staying strong all the way through, and it was a unified effort that showed their overall strength as performers. And for those of you who caught this production of Janacek's Jenufa at the Staatsoper Unter den Linden, what'd you think of it? Did you not like the production and you thought it was so frigid and really cold looking and you would have loved to have a lot more scenery? Did you feel like the singers were able to be at their A game, especially Evelyn Herlitzius as the Kostelniczka? Or did you feel like everything about this production of Jenufa, as well as the singers, just did not fit to your liking? Please comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my review of Janacek's Jenufa at the Staatsoper Unter den Linden. Please tune in next time for finally my review of Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, starring Hye Jung-moon as the Queen of the Night at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. So until then, good night everybody.